Hello and welcome to week 6 problem solving session for the NPTEL course on environmental impact assessment. This course is being taught by Dr. Harshit Soshan Lakra, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Planning at the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. I'm Isha Rathore, PMRF and Research Scholar at the Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. And every Saturday and Tuesday, we have these problem solving sessions for this particular course. So few housekeeping rules before we start the session. So please mute yourself for the session if you have any questions, or if you want to post the answers for the questions asked, you can put them in the chat box. At different points, I will ask you if you have any questions, and then you can raise your hands and unmute yourself for asking those questions. So the outline of the session is that we are going to look up at highlights from each of the from the this week's content, week 6 content. We're going to look up at the key takeaways from each of the lecture units which we covered in this week. We will also look up at assignment questions and their solutions with explanations and additional questions and answers for your practice based on this week's content. And if we received any queries from you regarding this week's content, we will also clarify those queries if we received any of them in the discussion forums. Okay, so let's begin. So week 6 looked up at EIA methods, tools, and techniques. So let's dive into the highlights from week 6. So the first lecture, lecture 26 in week 6, talked about EIA process starting at the initial stage. So here we looked up at the EIA process, setting up a management process for EIA activity. So the first step is building a team which is going to prepare this EIA report or study and going to undertake the process of environmental impact assessment. So the selection of team is done in such a way that you have an appropriate project team which has expertise in dealing with um, different aspects, and that the team is compatible and do not have any personal issues. So you have an appropriate project team. Then you have specialist input. So you have experts and specialists who are going to give you inputs at different points. So you're going to also have to manage these specialist inputs. Then you're also going to have to liaise or discuss with the project proponent or the developer or the constructor and the different various stakeholders who are going to be affected by this EIA project, by the development of that project for which EIA is being considered. So having their social inputs and how they are being affected, we're going to look up at the team has to deal with these various stakeholders and the public at different stages. A further lecture looks up at public consultation and participations relating to these. And you also have to, the project team also looks up at the participation techniques to use and the follow through which they're going to do. There's also going to be, they also have to do schedule management, what tasks and how at different stages needs to be incorporated. And they need to maintain the focus of AIA internally. That is, they all agree on the inherent, they are in agreement internally to the purpose of AIA, and they are doing a very coherent and robust job at it. And lastly, the team also needs to coordinate the contributions of the team in the various documentary outputs. So in the EIA report, you will have different parameters or factors for which you're going to do an EIA, for example, water, soil, geology, social EIA, and all of those things. So all of these inputs and outputs need to be coherent and needs to form a single narrative together. So the team has to look after that as well. So that is how you go about selecting your team members for doing the EIA. Then you also decide on the style of the EIA process. So how you are going to have the different findings and data, how are they going to be reported, what techniques have been used, what methods have been used, what participation style has been used. All of these, the team needs to be in agreement with, along with the project proponent or developer, as well as the team which is doing EIA, as well as what the experts have suggested as the participation tool or technique which should be used for mapping out the impacts and mitigation techniques for these. Then you also have to consider whether the EIA is being done is in a populated area or an unpopulated area. So they're going to be different in terms of how what methods, techniques will be used in these areas, whether the project affects vulnerable groups and how their impacts are going to be handled, whether they're going to do a different uh, impact assessment study for these vulnerable groups, like a social impact assessment, or are they going to include their effects in a certain head or something? So that is also something which the team and the process of EIA needs to be agreed on by the team. Whether it's going to be a rigorous, systematic, and intensive EIA process, whether it's going to be a rational or balanced process, how it's going to be rapidly done, or is it a very streamlined, longer process? Is it a democratic process? Whether different collaborative approaches have been undertaken in this AIA at different stages, whether they are going to do an ethical and adaptive EIA. Yes, we will look up at all of these definitions further down, but the style of the EIA process needs to be decided by the team along with the project proponent before they begin. So, in terms of terminology, so rigorous, systematic, and intensive AIA process is desirable where scientific analysis can support decision making. That is, scientific fact checking and scientific testing methods and things can support your decision making. So, for example, the content of a certain parameter in soil can affect whether a dam project or some level of project can be undertaken in that area. So that kind of scientific analysis can support your decision making. Then rational or balanced process is adopted where stakeholders can participate freely. So your people who are affected by the development of that project for which EIA is being undertaken, if they are taking part freely in that in the process of AIA, then it's a rational balanced process. Streamlined or rapid AIA processes when your resources are limited or you have less data to analyze. So then you have to do a streamlined AIA process. Democratic AIA process works best when proponents are willing to assign their decision-making authority to representatives who in turn have the time, energy, and resources to participate in the planning and decision-making process with other parties. So this is when the developer does not directly play a role in the EIA process, but they assign a different party to take all of those decisions on their behalf. Of course, they have to report back to the developer at different stages, but then this process is more democratic. That is, the direct interests of the developers are not aligned with the development of the project. So a more democratic approach can be taken. Then collaborative EIA is like a democratic process, but with stakeholders being directly engaged in the process and having the resources to do so. That is, the stakeholders also have an important say. In democratic EIA, there was a authority which the project proponent has given the powers to make decisions and be involved in the EIA process. But in collaborative EIA process, the stakeholders or the people who are being affected by the development of that project are involved in the planning and decision making stages uh, of the EIA report and the project intern. Okay, so these are some terms. Then ethical EIA process is required where issues of fairness, equity, and justice predominate, and when the stakeholders are willing to identify and reconcile these ethical conflicts. And adaptive EIA process is appropriate for turbulent and complex situations where risk, uncertainty, and health predominate, and where the EIA needs to take into account the knowledge limits and uncertainty related concerns. So these are some definitions which come out of this particular lecture. We looked up at the EIA screening process. So first, so these are the stages of the EIA. We have looked up at this in week 4, I believe. So the first stage is the project screening, where we look up at whether an EIA is needed or not. And then we further do scoping, like which impacts and which issues should be considered. Then the description of project, development actions, alternatives, description of environmental base case or baseline from which we are going to compare how this project is affecting the environment around it, and then the identification of key impacts. The next stage is screening, then scoping. Then we have impact prediction, where we predict the impacts and give mitigating measures on how to counterbalance the negative impacts coming out of the development of the project on the various environmental parameters. And we evaluate and assess the significance of impacts. And finally, we present these findings in the environmental impact study or the EIS report, which is further sent for decision making to the different authorities. And then there's a decision being made whether the EIS report is correct or whether the project can be developed and the mitigation measures be implemented. And further, lastly, after the project is developed, you have the post decision monitoring and the audit of predictions and mitigation measures. And at different stages, you have public consultation and participation in various forms as uh, deemed fit by the EIA team. This is the entire EIA process. So first we're going to look about EIA screening. So projects in India typically are based on the list of activities for which, like the list of the type of use of the project, and then they are given clearance based on whether an EIA is required for that particular area or not. So, for example, you have so for mining of activities, you have category A and category B. So, in category A, you have certain conditions which need to be met, for which EIA is required, and certain other categories will have all projects which need to do an EIA if they fall in this kind of use. So you can read about these projects further down also. So there's a threshold which needs to be met. So things like your crude oil refineries, thermal power plants, radioactive waste, large dams and reservoirs, agriculture, energy industry, all of these kind of projects require EIA. We will look up at the further thresholds required for doing EIA for the different kind of projects and what is the minimum area requirement for the project to be for which EIA needs to be done. But different agencies have these uh, thresholds for doing EIA. So a European Union 2017 guidance, it looks up at two different approaches for doing screening. So we have the thresholds approach and the case by case approach. So the threshold approach is simple to use, quick to use, and more certain. It's consistent between locations, consistent between decisions within locations, and consistent between project types. So thresholds is basically when you have, for example, for residential area, you have for all projects who have a built up area greater than a certain number, for them you need to do EIA irrespective of whatever is the other requirements of the course. So the area requirement or something of a threshold is considered for doing the screening process that EIA is required. Whereas a case by case is undertaken where you look up at the type of project, you give all of the major details, and then you see whether it will have a significant negative effect or not. And then on a case by case basis, you analyze whether this project requires an AIA or not. So, so in that sense, it's slightly flexible that it can incorporate the variety in the project and environment. And there are certain, of course, disadvantages associated with both of these screening methods. Then in AIA, we also look up at which impacts and what issues needs to be considered. So we have impact identification techniques like environmental attributes that are particularly valued should be identified. So whether, for example, a river and dam project will have a significant impact on the water and soil and geology kind of environmental attributes, as well as the social attribute where villages or people who are dependent on the river might have their livelihoods being affected. So these are three critical environmental attributes which you identify based on the type of the project, and then you highlight them more in your studies. Of course, you do it for all the other environmental parameters as well, but first the critical and most significant impacts and environmental attributes are identified. Second, how are you going to measure these impacts on the affected parties? Thirdly, you need to determine what is the methodology which you're going to use for predicting and evaluating these impacts, and the scale at which these impacts needs to be considered, whether it's at a local scale or a regional scale or national scale. All of these scales you need to consider. Then you also need to present them with alternatives, like broad alternatives, which are going to mitigate the negative aspects of these impacts. And then you're going to give outcomes in the on the case of like identification of key issues, impacts, and alternatives. So this is the part which you put in the report, that this is the impact we identified on this environmental parameter. These are the few mitigation measures. which we have suggested, and this impact was significant or of low significance, those kind of things you put in the EIA study. So we also have so crucial project dimensions include the purpose of the project, its life cycle, physical presence, processes which are undertaken during the construction stages, the policy context and associated policies. So reasonable alternatives like the no, in case of when we are considering alternatives, we have the no action option. So for example, if a particular alternative cannot uh, the impacts are significant, then you need to look up at alternative locations where the development can happen. That is, if you're trying to build up, let's say, in a forest, and that clearing out of that forest land is going to lead to a very significant environmental impact, then you need to look up at an alternative location instead of that particular site for building your project. So similarly, you need to look up at alternative scales of the project based on whatever the requirements of your development project is. Uh, if there is no alternative available, then you need to either change locations or look up at alternative locations or alternative scale of the project or the alternative processes, equipments, alternative site layout, alternative operating conditions, and the alternative ways of dealing with environmental impacts. So these are if you have a no action mitigation measure or the alternative for your impacts. Okay. So then we have the baseline study from which we derive our data and consider the project's impact. So you establish a baseline based on the data which is available to you from either already existing data sources or from similar kind of case studies which have been undertaken. So sources and presentation of data include your hard data from reliable sources. So these can include data sources like census, environmental accounts, transport statistics from your state government, central government, public health profiles, and other national and regional internet data sources. It can also include data from your local authority monitoring units, like your pollution control board will have units. Air pollution monitoring devices and all of those things. So, if certain monitoring units are present within the context of your site or near to that site, you can use that data for establishing your baseline cases and taking data from it. You can also use additional data from unpublished or semi published internal or other organizations which are there. So, these are the data sources which you can use for establishing your baseline for doing AIA. Then for impact identification, the aim is to ensure compliance with regulations, which is the mandatory regulations are being met first of all, and whether any voluntary regulation is being met if it's relevant for a particular case. You also need to provide a comprehensive coverage of the full range of impacts which are occurring on an environmental parameter, including your social, economic, and physical impacts. You also need to distinguish between positive, negative, large, small, long term, short term, reversible, irreversible impacts. Whether these impacts, whether two or more impacts lead to cumulative impacts or secondary or indirect impacts are happening because of direct impacts. You also need to distinguish the significance of these impacts, whether that impact is significant or not significant, fairly significant, and on that scale, also you need to assess the impacts. You need to provide a comparison of alternative development proposals which have undertaken, which have either faced these kind of impacts or have certain mitigation measures which led to mitigating this impact. Whether it's whether you need to incorporate qualitative or quantitative information for use, whether you have uh, unbiased measurement or data from which you have derived this impact and whether you have consistent results out of it. And then you need to summarize all of this in the environmental impact study along with the mitigating measures which you are proposing for the particular impacts which you have identified. Then for impact identification, we have certain methods or how do you assess the impact. So first is you can have a checklist kind of study being undertaken by either with experts or with stakeholders. So you can have questions relating to whether this project is going to lead to contamination of land or water because of the release of pollutants at any stage of. So these are basically questions, and you can answer it with yes or no, and which characteristics of the project is going to be affected. So in a questionnaire form, you gather this data from the different stakeholders as well as experts. Uh, in a sort of questionnaire form. So that is the first one, which is checklist. Then you can have a simple matrix where you list out the different environmental parameters like soil, flora, fauna, air quality, employment, traffic, housing, all of these different parameters you have identified on which you are measuring the impacts of the development of the project. And then, so this is a simple matrix where you can have the different stages of the development of the project, like construction, operation. If the project have multiple buildings, you can have utilities, residential, commercial buildings, and all of those things. And whether any action or development is going to have an impact on soil, all of these things, you can just do a quick, simple matrix kind of study to identify which areas will going to, which environmental um, which parameters are going to have any sort of environmental impact. You can identify them using these simple matrices, or you can use like a magnitude matrices where you have color based and significance based uh, similar sort of impact assessment. So you have, let's say, the development of this project is going to have a largely negative effect. Development of residential and commercial building is going to have a very large negative impact on the flora of the project site. And whether park and open spaces are going to have a large positive impact on this in terms of flora. So you can do a similar significance or significance based assessment also using matrices. So this is an example of a magnitude matrix. Then you can use quantitative methods where you use data from similar kind of projects and use it. Next, we have networks where we established the kind of different things. For example, for bus corridor improvements, you have different kind of facilities or bus lanes, different kind of infrastructure being developed, and how it's going to affect which networks are connected, how they're going to affect all of these things. So you establish networks to go about identifying the impacts. So those are networks, and then you have overlay maps where you overlay which areas are environmental, different kind of areas, and whether what constraints they are going to face on particular areas based on the development of whatever infrastructure utilities plan or development is planned. So you can use overlay kind of maps as well to assess and point out which areas are going to be affected by what uh, and in what environmental parameter. So these are different methods for you which can be used for initial impact identification. So for doing the prediction identifications, you need to look up at first the direct and indirect impacts, whether the development of the project is having development of project including infrastructure, utilities, or any other aspect relating to that project is going to have a direct or indirect impact, whether there's going to be a geographical how much is the geographical extent of the impacts, whether it's a beneficial, whether it's like a positive impact or a negative impact, what is the durations of the impact, whether it's a short term, long term, reversible, irreversible, whether two or more impacts are coming together, so cumulative impacts, and what is the prediction over the life of the project and the rate of change of impact. So all of these are impact identification or prediction things which you need to consider. Uh, then you also have quantitative or qualitative impact. So quantitative is something like air quality change, which you can see in terms of numbers, in terms of the number of pollutants which are present in the air. So ppm, parts per million or parts per billion, is an indicator for which you use for measuring the volume of pollutants which are present in the air. And something like qualitative could be a visual impact that you can't it does not look visually pleasing. So that is a qualitative impact, which cannot be measured in terms of quantitative numbers. So And then, so impacts in explicit units. So it gives you a strong foundation for evaluation. So you can evaluate how much change has happened over the time, what exchange needs to be done for doing certain trade-offs. That is, if your air quality is below 50, what can be done? Like your air quality requirement is below 50, then what can be done to bring it from 100 to 50 down? So you can have kind of uh, a stronger foundation of what measures work, because there will be cases in which this has been established from another study, and you can directly use that data to suggest these kind of mitigation effects. Okay. Quantification is preferred when you have to do comparisons for local, national, and international standards, but quantifiable impacts or units give you this advantage in terms of suggesting for mitigation measures. So again, for impact predictions, you can have methods and models for prediction. So you have basically two categories of first is you can have mathematical and computer-based models. So in these in mathematical and computer-based models, you can have models which are deterministic models, which are dependent on the fixed relationship between parameters. And then you have stochastic models which are based on statistical probability, and which have basically certain number of events which will take place in the given area and or time interval. So you have numerical values and statistical inputs coming from different sources. Okay. Again, for methods now, these impact predictions can be hard modeled or soft modeled. So hard modeled is when mathematical simulation model play a central role. So for example, for your air and noise impacts, you have uh, you need to model you need to have like a mathematical simulation model which plays the significant impact. That is, you give it all of these parameters on what is the pollutant concentration, and it will give you the shape of the pollution or the different aspects of the uh, environment basically. So you get everything out of this mathematical simulation in a more or less accurate manner. Whereas soft models are when the use of mathematical simulation, it gives you non-existent uh, is basically non-existent. So for example, for mapping of your cultural resource assessments, or for mapping inventories or perception-based studies, these cannot be undertaken by so those kind of categories which require let's say visual sort of uh, qualitative kind of data, they are soft modeled, whereas quantitative kind of data can be hard modeled. Okay. So a strategy for your soft modeled is photo montage. So a photo montage is superimposition of an image onto a photograph in order to create a realistic representation of how the proposed structure will appear in the landscape. So you can basically combine two photos. One is sort of like a rendered version of how the site is going to look after that particular strategy has been implemented, and uh, the other photo is the existing condition. So you can see how visually effective your impact prediction is, or how visible you can see. So for example, if building up a air tower, how it's going to look up in the overall positioning of the site. So that is where photo montage can be used. It's again a prediction method. Then you have mixed models where you have both models being used, which is soft and hard models, whereas computer simulations are also used, whereas lower level non-technical approaches are also used. So something like traffic impact can be used, can can be modeled correctly based on computer models, but you need to have some sort of survey input from the perception-based studies for modeling it correctly. So that is an example of mixed model impact prediction method. Okay, then outputs which are required for impacts under consideration. So you have the geographical areas, different stages of assessment, what resource you have, what is the criteria of replicability, what is the consistency or accuracy required, and what is the adaptability of the impact. Then these are again some other methods and models which we discussed in these in lecture 27. So causal networks are diagrams that demonstrate the causal relation between their elements and can be used to transparently demonstrate cause and effect. So the special identifiers of the causal networks are a diagrammatic representation of relationship between the different elements and the attribution of causality to those relationships. And these networks, these are basically abstract diagrams which have nodes and links. So both the network logic and the causal knowledge logic of the causal networks, it relates well to the EIA process. So different kind of we will see these network diagrams as well further. Then we also need to look up at uncertainty in the EIA process. So uncertainty about the working environment, uncertainty about the guiding values, and uncertainty about related decisions. So at different points in the EIA process, you're going to have uncertainty relating to environment. Where you don't have enough information. So you need more information relating to your environment. So you need to do investigation, research, survey, analysis, forecasting to come to the decision problem. In terms of guiding values, you need to define, the project team needs to define clearer objectives, whether they're going to aim for meeting the policy guidelines or what are their aims. They have to set their priorities on what environmental impact, what parameter needs to be more focused on and is more critical for this project, and how are they going to involve others, experts, and stakeholders in that project. In terms of making decisions, when they are uncertain about making decisions, there need to be a coordinated approach. That is, they're going to require, they need to liaison and plan and negotiate and broaden their agenda so that the team internally as well as with experts can come to a common ground regarding the decision making process. So that is how you deal with uncertainty in the IA process. Handling uncertainty, you need to have a structured involvement of stakeholders at different stages of the project. This is done by public consultation and different approaches of public participation, which we will look up in a further lecture in this week only. They need to agree on the actions and options based on the robustness of the EIA which they're going to undertake. So the project team needs to be very clear on the objectives of doing the EIA, and there needs to be an internal understanding between the team members on what are their objectives for doing the EIA. And they need to be aware about the resources which they have and the time and deadlines which they have. So they need to have the team as a unit needs to have this understanding and work towards it. How are they going to model the interactions among the impacts? What are going to be the assumptions which they are undertaking, and whether they are correct or not? So they need to do all of these. They need to have a sort of baseline for these. They also need to do sensitivity analysis on what parameters are sensitive and lead to a more have a play a more significant factor in causing the impact. Then they also need to look up at monitoring, comprehensive and sensitive monitoring, and state their assumptions and give the results which they are giving in a certain confidence range, that this is 90 to 95% is accurate according to our assessments. Okay, then for certain forecasting data sources we looked up at. So, for example, your World Economic Forum, United Nations Environment Program, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. All of these agencies, they give certain data sources. They are basically data sources from which you can take certain baseline numbers for different categories. So in India, you can also use the CPCB data for in using for your impact predictions for quantitative analysis. Then moving on to lecture 28, we looked up at the EIA process, impact evaluation, mitigation, and enhancement. So here we first look up at impact evaluation and importance of significance. So this is a decision tree for determining whether there's environmental acceptability of a mitigation strategy. So first is whether there's an impact. So for example, let's consider water as one of the environmental parameter which the development project is affecting. So whether let's identify whether let's say the impact is water pollution. So is water pollution acceptable, whether it is in the acceptable threshold limit? Let's say we don't want the pollutant concentration in water to be up to a certain limit. If it's beyond, then it's not acceptable. If that limit is, let's say, if the threshold limit is 50 and our water pollution limit is 100, then it's not acceptable. But it is manageable with certain commitment from the developer. That is, they're going to have some sort of filtering program, water filtration or rainwater harvesting, and all of these different kind of things, basically some mitigation measure. If that number can be brought down to within 50, then this is a manageable impact. Whether with regulatory controls this can be done or whether with the commitment of the developer, it's manageable. If it is, let's say, 200, it is unacceptable. That is, it is not manageable because of the both of these two measures. So then you need to redesign to remove or avoid this water pollution source which is happening, or either you need to abandon this project or the whole in part. Okay, so that is how you do environmental impact assessment. You look up at each impact and see whether it falls in which category and what further steps needs to be undertaken. Okay. So you also need to look up at the significant spectrum, where you look up at whether these impacts are significant and they can be mitigated. So your impact is going to be, let's say, at a particular in the diagram, if we consider impacts, this is the acceptable site and this is the unacceptable site. And you have a certain significance or threshold value which you don't want to cross for the impact to be significant or not. So if your impact is, you want to impact to be as close to the acceptable site as possible, and definitely beyond the significance threshold. It should not be on the other side where it is unacceptable. If your impact is on the unacceptable side, you can take certain mitigation measures and bring it towards the within the significance threshold. So this gives you this allows your impact to be acceptable with certain interventions as proposed by the based on the developer's commitment, of course. These can be mitigated. So this gives you an edge towards getting your project approved, because you are taking measures for counterbalancing your impacts which are coming out of the development of the project. Okay. Then we have so you also have framework for judging environmental acceptability. So you have negotiable and non-negotiable impacts. So negotiable impacts, for example, from an ecological perspective, where we look up at physical and biological systems or components. Your negotiable impacts are no degradation beyond the carrying capacity of the ecosystem, no degradation of productive systems, wise use of natural resources. So these are your negotiable impacts, whereas non-negotiable impacts includes which you cannot agree on. So these include it degrades essential life support system, degrades the conservation estate, and adversely affects ecological integrity and loss of biodiversity. These are non-negotiable impacts. That is, you're not going to give in to these impacts. You need to certainly take measures to mitigate if any of these impacts are happening. So on humans, like humans as individuals or in social groupings like humans or communities, non-negotiable impacts include your loss of human life. You don't want your project to lead to any sort of loss of human life. Any reduction in public health and safety and acceptability unreasonably degrades the quality of life where people live. Whereas your negotiable impacts can include community benefits and costs and where they are born, reasonable appropriation of costs and benefit, reasonable appropriation of intergenerational equity, and compatibility with defined environmental policy goals. Okay, so this is one framework for judging environmental acceptability on ecological and human systems, and what are negotiable and non-negotiable impacts. Okay. Then there are certain other criteria and standards for determining the significance threshold for impacts. These are based on scientific evidence, the value of the affected environment, level of public concern, political repercussions, public interest or perception, public perception, past and current perceptions of the significance and impact of particular issue will matter. Then certain determinants for determining the environmental significance. So your value, sensitivity, and quality of the environment, which is likely to be impacted, the extent of the likely impacts, the consequences of the likely impacts or changes, resilience of the environment to cope up with these changes, cumulative impacts with other projects or with other developments in the project, the level of confidence of the impacts predicted, that is the accuracy out of your simulation studies, or the accuracy of the collected data or data source, the objects of the act, policies, guidelines, procedures, and standards against which a proposal can be assessed, the public concern, presence of strategic planning policy framework, or the extent to which other statutory decision making processes meet the Environmental Protection Agency's objective and the principle of doing the EIA. So all of these needs to be considered when you determine the significance of impacts on the environment. Then you also need to do, you can also do a cost benefit analysis, which is basically a technique for making decision making technique in which full consequences in terms of costs and benefits of a course of action are summarized in terms of money or in monetary terms. So the results of the cost benefit analysis, or CBA, it can give you can be used in two key ways. First is to provide insight into whether a project or policy provides a net economic cost or benefit to a company or society. And the second is to compare the outcomes of different projects or policy alternatives. So provides you gives you an approach for measuring and valuing some non-market goods such as human health. So different stages of cost benefit analysis include defining the project or policy, identifying the physical impacts of the project or policy, valuing these impacts, discounting of cost and benefit flows, and applying the net present value test, applying the sensitivity analysis, that is which factors are affecting more than which are more significant. Okay, then there are three key definitions which come out of this lecture unit. So first is the shadow pricing, which is aggregation over goods. That is, you compare the cost in one form and the benefits in other forms. So for example, concrete, which is used in dam, and electricity, which is produced from it. So your concrete is the cost and your electricity produced is the benefit. So this is shadow pricing. You compare two entities which do not have the same unit, basically. So that is shadow pricing. Then you have the discount pricing, which is aggregation over time. So you are comparing cost incurred now with benefits that are expected in the future. So that is, you're undertaking the cost now, but you're comparing the benefits in the future. So this is based over time. Then equity weights, these are aggregation over people. That is, you're comparing the cost which is occurring to different people. So cost of 100 rupees to a wealthy person is nothing compared to the cost of 100 rupees to a poor person. So equity weights are applied in those cases where there's a cost basis, which is aggregation over people. That is, you are comparing the cost for different category of people, different type of people. So these three definitions. Then you have methods for evaluating non-market goods or intangible goods, which you can refer to in your in the lecture unit. Let's not go through this. Then we also looked about multi-criteria decision analysis, or the MCDA. So this is a variant of the multi-criteria analysis, or the MCA, and it provides you, it's particularly applicable to cases where the single criteria approach is not appropriate. And it allows the decision makers or the project team to integrate the environmental, social, and economic values and the preference of stakeholders. And the evaluation is based on a variety of quantitative or semi-quantitative and qualitative assessments and survey methods. So the approach defines the objective, chooses the criteria to measure the objectives, specifies alternatives, transforms the criteria scales into units, weighs the criteria to reflect the relative importance, and selects and applies a mathematical algorithm for ranking the alternatives and chooses the alternative which comes as the best alternative, so the best case. Then we also looked up at the Leopold matrix, which came out in 1977. So we have the different categories which are identified and the different descriptions and actions which can be undertaken under them. So we will not go through this, but this was also discussed in lecture 28. Then we also looked about mitigation in this lecture. So mitigation, as defined by the Directive 2014-52 EU, is defined as the measured envisioned to avoid, prevent, reduce, or if possible offset any identified significant adverse effects on the environment and where appropriate of any proposed monitoring arrangements. So any sort of action which is undertaken to reverse back the negative impacts of the negative effects of the impact are considered as mitigation measures. According to NEPA, mitigation is defined as not taking certain actions, limiting the proposed action and its implementation, repairing, rehabilitating, or restoring the affected environment, presentation and maintenance action during the life of the action, and replacing or providing substitute resources or environment. So this is a definition, two definitions of the same term mitigation, but by two different agencies. We also looked up at the mitigation hierarchy. So this is like a top-down approach. So you first want to avoid any sort of potential impact on any environmental parameter arising out of any development because of your project. Then you need to minimize, that is, decrease the spatial or temporal scale of the impact during the design, constructions, etc. You need to rectify, that is, you need to apply rehabilitation techniques after the impact has occurred. You need to then compensate or offset the residual impact and compensate as appropriate. Or and lastly, to enhance, that is, you apply measures to create new benefits. So you go about in this order, that is, you go from a top-down approach. The first step is to avoid any sort of negative impact which is happening. If you can't avoid, then you should minimize. If you can't, if you are not able to just if you are able to minimize, you can try to rectify it. If you can't, if you are able to rectify it, aim for compensating it and then enhancing it further. So you go about in this hierarchy when you are designing mitigation measures. Okay. Then we also have the EU guidance on the types of mitigation measures which are there. So measures to prevent. So impact avoidance can be done by changing means or techniques, that is, not undertaking certain projects or components that can result in adverse impacts. Changing the site, avoiding any environmentally sensitive areas, putting in place preventive measures to stop adverse effects from occurring. Measures to reduce. Now, impact minimization can happen by scaling down or relocating the project, redesigning certain elements of the project, designing using a different technology, or taking supplementary measures to reduce the impacts either at the source or at the receptor, such as your noise barriers, waste gas treatment, type of road surface, etc. And measures to offset. Now, these are measures which are taken to offset or compensate for any residual adverse effect which is still there that cannot be avoided or further reduced. So, measures in this case can be like site rehabilitation or restoration, resettlement, or monetary compensation to the affected stakeholders. Now, again, we also have UK mitigation guidance, which classifies a different type of mitigation. Uh, this is also from 1997. Then we looked up at certain enhancement examples. We will not go through them. You can refer to the lecture unit for them. We also looked about community benefit agreements. So these are agreements which provide a range of benefits, partly in recognition of communities which are hosting projects perceived as being in the national interest, that is, renewable energy projects which contribute to climate change policy. So these are agreements which are signed between these stakeholders as well as the developer, and it gives certain benefits to the community for causing disrupting their livelihood and changes in their lifestyle. So the type of benefits include financial incentives like annual payments, lump sum or both, and social benefits including, for example, additional transport improvements, affordable housing, village halls, and improved telecom communications. So that is the community benefit agreement. We also had certain basic sustainability assessment trade-offs. So you have maximum net gains, burden of argument on trade-off proponent, avoidance of significant adverse effects, protection of the future, explicit justification, and open process. You can read about them in the lecture unit. Then lecture 29 looked up at EIA process, participation, presentation, and review. So first, we looked up at the conceptual understanding of public participation from the legislative provisions which are there. We have the Principle 10 of Rio Declaration, the Aarhus Convention, and we have uh, the United, this is the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, the UNECE. And we also have legislation in India which was so major amendment was made to the EIA notification of 1997, which introduced public hearing as a part of assessment procedure for ensuring the participation of local people and stakeholders in the different stages of the development process. Then public consultation was included in the EIA notification of 2006. So it refers to the process by which the concerns of local affected people and others who have plausible stake in the environmental impacts of the project or activity are ascertained with a view to take into account all the material concerns in the project's activity, design as appropriate, and different categories of projects are made to have this public consultation mandatory. So we also looked about the different forms of public participation. So you have so this is a ladder of citizen participation as defined in Austin 1971. So we have non-participation forms like manipulation, therapy, informing. Then you have tokenism, which is just participation for the sake of participation. You have informing, consultation, placation, then citizen power, where the stakeholders have more power, partnership, delegated power, citizen control. So as you move up the ladder, the control to the public increases. So this when applied to the EIA participation, public participation can be understood in that terms. Then four levels of increasing public participation, public power and participation methods include information feedback approaches, consultation, joint planning, and delegated authority. So, information feedback is any sort of film or PowerPoint presentation, television information kit, newspaper accounts or advertisements, news conference, press release, print materials, technical report, website notice, etc. So, by this information feedback, you basically give them some sort of make them aware about the kind of development which is going to happen, and then so they are basically made aware. This is on the scale of let's say informing. This is quite low on the uh, participation ladder. So the extent of public power in decision making is nothing. The advantages are that it is a quick, informative process. The public is made of, the stakeholders are made aware about the kind of project which is going to be developed. But the disadvantages are there's no feedback route back to the developer, and the presentation is subject to bias, and whatever opinions these people have, they are never reflected or directed back towards the project developer. So that's the first approach, information feedback. The second approach is consultation, which includes a public hearing, briefing, ombudsperson or representative survey, interview, response sheet, etc. So this is a low level of low public power and decision making. It allows for two-way information transfer, but it allows limited discussion. That is, you will have one public hearing or a few interviews or surveys, and that is going to include some sort of bias or the limited data, basically. Then it does not permit ongoing communication and somewhat is time consuming. Those are the disadvantages associated with it. The third is joint planning. The third method, joint planning. So it includes advisory committee, workshop, informal meeting, role playing, panels, interactive polling, future search conference, etc. This has moderate public power and decision making. The advantages are that it permits continuing inputs and feedbacks and increases the education and involvement of citizens. And the disadvantages are that it is very time consuming and dependent on what information is provided by the planners. Then the last, which has the highest public power and decision making, is delegated authority. So these are citizen review board, citizen planning commission, citizen jury, task force, community facilitation, mediation and negotiations, etc. And it permits for better access to relevant information, permits greater control over options and the timing of the decision. But it's a long-term commitment, and it is difficult to include wide representation on the small board. So these are the four methods which we see in the different form of participations which can happen. So participation is defined as approaches that give a more active role to the public in influencing the plan development and approval, whereas consultations are exercises involving a passive audience. The public views are solicited, but respondents have little active influence over any resulting discussion decisions. So, the purpose for public participation in EIA is three purposes basically broadly. The first is to obtain public input into decisions which are taken elsewhere. So, this provides information to the public, it fills in the information gaps, and it's used for problem solving and social learning and understanding the context of the stakeholders. The second purpose is to share the decision making with the public. So, this reflects the democratic EIA process, which we discussed initially, how EIA should be. And is used to obtain the consent of those affected. It includes democracy in practice or participation as an educative function, and it includes the diverse uh, stakeholders which are there affected. So, a pluralist representation. And the third purpose is to alter the distribution of power and structures of decision making. And this is to involve marginalized groups. And to shift the locus of decision making from between the developers and the local people to give the public more power in the decision making, such that uh, uh, their views and feedbacks are included in the mitigation measures which are suggested in the EIA report. Then challenges of public participation include inconclusive decisions. So as there are different groups, there are going to be different interests and priorities, and sometimes there are going to be clashes between the interests of one or two groups, and this can lead to inconclusive decisions. The decisions may favor those loud and are able to create pressure compared to actual people affected. So it's obviously in a group you have people who are loud and more vocal about things things or development activities which are affecting them. So these might get more registered compared to the actual people who are being affected and who are not as loud as the one person who's more loud. And it also includes problems like delays, activism, conflict, unstopped development. So these are certain challenges to the public participation. We also have the United Nations Environment Program. It lists five interrelated components for effective public participation. These are the identification of groups or individuals interested in or affected by the proposed development. Second is the provision of accurate, understandable, pertinent, and timely information. Third is establishing a dialogue between those responsible for the decisions and those affected by them. Fourth is assimilation of what the public says in the decision. And fifth is feedbacks about actions taken and how the public influence that decision. So, this is the UNEP's five interrelated components for effective public participation. Again, important. Then we also looked up at the requirements for effective participation and methods. So certain key terms are defined like public, which is a complex amalgam of interest groups which change over time and from project to project. The public can be broadly classified into environmental interest groups. These are voluntary groups, quasi-statutory bodies, or issue-based pressure groups, which are concerned with a specific aspect of the environment or with the environment as a whole. Then we have the project affected people, people who are living near a proposed development who may be directly affected by it. Then we also looked up at the methods for public participation and their effectiveness. So you have you have basically different measures and the effective different measures and how effective are they in certain aspects. So something like a poll is more effective in two-way communication, whereas a site visit is more effective in providing information and catering to special interests. Working groups, citizen review boards are more effective in decision making. Public inquiry litigation also more effective in decision making. So you can read this through the legend which is given. Then we also looked up at EIA presentation, so how the report is made, what are the contents and organization. So first we have the summary, which includes the project description, description of environment, anticipated environmental impacts and mitigation measures, the environmental monitoring program, additional studies, project benefits and environmental management plan. We also looked up at certain examples of India sector-wise EIA manuals for your hydropower EIA, for the building construction and area development projects. Then we also looked up at the review of EIA. So from an Indian context, we looked up at how EIA is being reviewed, how the report when submitted is reviewed, and how decisions are made. So your National Green Tribunal Act of 2010 established the National Green Tribunal for effective and fast clearance of the legal cases relating to environmental protection. Then that was what we discussed in lecture 29. Moving on to lecture 30, we looked up at EIA process, but the follow-up process, that is monitoring and auditing. So monitoring is done for monitoring for conformance or monitoring for compliance post decision. So monitoring for conformance is done for the collection of data in comparison with standards, predictions, or expectations that provide proof of technological management or operational control against a specific consent requirement or voluntary mitigation measure. Whereas monitoring for for compliance post decision is done through after the development has happened, and whether the environmental management frameworks are undertaken to demonstrate how the collective body of consent conditions or voluntary mitigation measures will be enacted and complied with. Then evaluation is for future knowledge management, for future consents and license management, for liability avoidance, such that any to offset the future risk or liability or compensation issues. So you can read about the key elements of the each of these three terms. Then communication as well for consent, closure, pre-decision, stakeholder communication, the different activities which are undertaken, what methods and proposals and things are considered in this are also looked up. Then we have definitions for the key terms which were used in the lecture unit. So monitoring is where you measure, record all the variables or parameters of your concern at certain intervals, such as air quality, water quality, noise level, etc. And the collected data is a large quantity of data, and it's done in a systematic manner for a considerably long period of time. And then how this is being analyzed for whatever uh, impact assessments and things needs to be undertaken. So then we have the environmental impact auditing or evaluation. So this is for comparing the impacts predicted, what was done in the EIA report with the actual after implementation measures. So this helps to evaluate how was the impact prediction, how accurate was the impact prediction, and how good the mitigation measures are working. Whether what was proposed is actually meeting up and how well it is meeting up and reducing the negative effects of the impact. Then environmental management auditing, it reviews public and private corporate pattern and programs for environmental management and the associated risks and liabilities. Then implementation monitoring, it involves the checking of the project such that whatever has been implemented is in accordance with the planning approval, that the mitigation measures have been carried out as proposed, and that any conditions associated with the approval has been honored. So key questions for follow-up. So what the monitoring data should include? It should include indicators such as your ambient air quality, noise levels, etc. It should include causal factors, that is the decisions and policy of local authority and developer. It helps to understand how policies and decisions need to change over time. It should also include the social aspects and people perception. So it should have a section to look up at how to improve public participation and support for future projects through the constant learning. And it also helps to take care of all the impacts which we talked about in the report, and how they are being taken care. And this can be used for further studies as well. Then we had the post-environment clearance monitoring, as I highlighted by the EIA notification of 2006. So under Section 10, which is the post-environment clearance, they are required to submit half-yearly compliance report in respect to the stipulated prior environment clearance terms and conditions. And they should be public document. They should be made public, and they should be displayed on the website of the concerned developer or authority where the project has been listed as well. Then component monitoring, it should include a summary of significant impacts which were identified in the environmental impact report. It should include the mitigation measures which are recommended for each of the significant impact, what monitoring requirements and responsible agencies are required, will be monitoring these different parameters for each of the measure which is being done. Then personal agency responsible for monitoring, the timing and frequency of the monitoring, and the agency responsible for ensuring the compliance with the monitoring program. Then we also looked up at certain international monitoring practices in EU, UK, Canada, and Australia, and specific cases of US. Hong Kong, and in developing countries as well. So, certain challenges which are associated with doing monitoring in developing countries are first the cost for carrying out the monitoring study, because these agencies are usually on low budgets and low funding. So, that cost is one of the factors which affects the monitoring studies of projects. Then the accessibility of relevant data and information, public awareness and involvement, and the ability to enforce decisions. Certain more developing countries experience we looked up at. You can go back to this lecture for more detailed understanding. And then we looked up at reference case studies as well for the London Olympic site. Okay. So let's move on now to the question and answers. So you can post your answer in the chat box, and I will moderate the chat box. Okay, so the first question is impact prediction in EIA involves identification of the following. Uh, A, geographical extent of impacts, B, duration of the impact, C, prediction over the life of a project, and D, all of the above. Okay, so since it's just you, I think I will just go with it. So you say D. So D is the correct answer. So prediction identification is done for all three which are mentioned, along with direct and indirect impacts, the benefits or beneficial or adverse impacts, the rate of change of impacts, irreversible or irreversible impact, cumulative impacts, as well as all the three options which are mentioned. So the correct answer is D, all of the above. Moving on to next question, state true or false. The superimposition of an image onto a photograph in order to create a realistic representation of how the proposed structure will appear in the landscape is called photomontage. Is the statement true or false? So this is one of the, okay. So you say A. So A is the correct answer. So when you superimpose an existing photograph with a super realistic representation of how the proposed development is going to look on this existing photograph, just to show visually how the proposed development is going to look, is known as photomontage. So the statement is true. So A is the correct answer. Moving on to next question, state true or false. Stochastic models indicate the degree of probability of the occurrence of a certain event by specifying the statistical probability that a certain number of events will take place in a given area and or given time interval. Is this statement true or false? Okay. So yes, the statement is true. So stochastic models indicate the probability of occurrence of a certain event based on the statistical probability that a certain number of events will take place in a given area or time interval, whereas deterministic models are dependent on a fixed relationship between the variables. So the statement is true. Moving on to the next question. According to the table, if there is a loss of human life in the project, will the trade-off be acceptable? So the options are: is this trade-off acceptable, or is this a non-acceptable trade-off? So if the project leads to loss of life, okay, no. Okay. So the correct answer is it's a non-acceptable trade-off. If the project leads to a loss of life, you cannot give a sufficient enough trade-off to justify whether this should be an outcome out of your project. So this is what negotiable and non-negotiable impacts are from. Negotiable impacts lead to trade-offs. That is, whatever this impact can be negotiated if there's a certain mitigation measure associated with this, but this impact, non-negotiable impacts, cannot be accepted even with trade-offs if it leads to, let's say, loss of life, loss of biodiversity. These are the impacts for which trade-offs can't be made. That is, if your project is going to lead to these kind of impacts, then you need to abandon that aspect of the project or suggest some. This is like a no option alternative approach. So this is a non-acceptable trade-off. Okay. Moving on to the next question. The criteria and standards for determining the impact significance thresholds in EIA includes the following: A, scientific evidence; B, political repercussions; C, public interest or perception; or and D, all of the above. Okay, so we have an answer D. So D is the correct answer. So the criteria and standards for determining significance of thresholds in EIA include scientific evidence, political repercussions, public interests or perceptions. So all three options A, B, and C are correct. Apart from this, we also have the value of the affected environment, the level of public concern, the public interest or perception, past and current perceptions of the significance, and the impact of particular issues. So the option D is correct. Moving on to the next question. So match the terms given in group A with their description in group B. So we have from terms given in group A and their definitions or descriptions given in group B. Okay. So we have contingent valuation, which is people are asked what they are willing to pay for keeping X, that is a good view or a historic building, or preventing Y, or what they are willing to accept for losing A or tolerating B. So you determine the cost of a particular entity by based on what they're going to pay, what they're willing to pay for keeping a certain thing or for preventing a certain thing, and what they're willing to accept for losing that particular thing. That is contingent valuation. So for example, if you have a let's say contingent valuation, then so P matches with 3, then Q, contingent ranking or stated preference, matches with 4, that is people are asked to rank their preference for various environmental goods, which may then be valued by linking the preference to the real price of something traded in the market, example the house prices. So Q matches with 4. Then R, indirect market prices, uh, matches with 2. That is the dose response approach seeks to measure the effect. Example, the value of loss of fish stock resulting from an environmental change, for example, oil pollution from a fish farm, by using the market value of the output involved. So R matches with 2. Then S, which is the effect of on production, matches with 1, which is where the market exists for the goods and services involved, and the environmental impact can be represented by the value of the change in output that it causes. So the option D, which is P matches with 3, Q matches with 4, R matches with 2, and S matches with 1 is the correct answer. Okay, moving on to the next question. Fill in the blank space for P and Q to complete the list of steps of mitigation hierarchy in EIA. So the correct answer is A, that is P is avoid and Q is rectify. So you go down from the mitigation hierarchy. It's a top-down approach. You try to avoid, minimize, rectify, compensate, and enhance. So option A, that is P was avoid and Q was rectify is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following principles of the Rio Declaration promotes public participation in environmental decision making and access to information and justice in environmental matters? So the options are A, Principle 1, B, Principle 2, C, Principle 10, and D, Principle 17. Okay, so the correct answer is C, Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration. It promotes public participation in environmental decision making and access to information and justice in environmental matters. So C, Principle 10 is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question, state true or false. In India, AIA notification of 2006 defines public consultation as the process by which the concerns of local affected persons and others who have plausible stake in the environmental impacts of the project or activity are ascertained with a view to taking into account all the material concerns in the project or activity design as appropriate. Is the statement A true or false? So the statement is true. Uh, According to the EIA notification of 2006, public consultation has been included. So the statement is true. So A is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. 10. Label the ladder of participation of EIA in correct sequence. So we have P, Q, and R. So is it option A? P is citizen control, Q partnership, R consultation. So these are the three terms which are missing, and then you need to ascertain the order of P, Q, and R. So the correct answer is A, that is P is citizen control, Q is partnership, and R is consultation. So as you move up the ladder of participation of EIA, citizen public power increases. So the topmost is P, citizen control, then delegated power, then partnership, location, consultation, informing, therapy, and manipulation. Okay, moving on to the next question. So match the following terms in Group A with their description in Group B. In Group A, we have consultation and participation, and in Group B, we have their definitions. So the correct answer is B, that is, consultation are exercises involving a passive audience. The public's views are solicited, but respondents have little active influence over any resulting decisions. And Q, participation is matches with one, which is approaches that give a more active role to the public in influencing the plan development and approval. So Q matches with one. So moving on to, so the correct answer is B, that is P matches with two and Q matches with one. Moving on to the next question. So match the following styles of EIA process of Group A with the description of Group B. So in Group A, we have the different EIA type processes, EIA process styles, and in Group B, we have their definitions. So the correct answer is A, that is, a rigorous EIA process is a systematic and intensive EIA process. Is done when a systematic and intensive EIA process is desirable, where scientific analysis can support decision making. So P matches with 2. Q is democratic EIA process, so it works best when proponents are willing to assign their decision making authority to representatives, who in turn have the time, energy, and resources to participate in planning and decision making processes with other parties. So Q matches with 1. Then ethical EIA process is required where issues of fairness, equity, and justice predominate, and where the stakeholders are willing to identify and reconcile their ethical conflicts. So R matches with 4. And then adaptive EIA process is appropriate for turbulent and complex situations where risk, uncertainty, and health predominate, and where the EIA needs to take into account knowledge limits and uncertainty related concerns. So S matches with 3. So the correct answer is A, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 1, R matches with 4, and S matches with 3. So moving on to the next question, state true or false. European Union of 2017 C guidance is on scoping. Is the statement true or false? So the correct answer is false. So the European Union 2017 guidance, 2017 C guidance is on screening and not on scoping. So the given statement is false. The European Union guidance is on screening checklist for the case-by-case screening tools. Okay, it gives the case-by-case as well as the threshold screening tools. So this statement is B, false. Moving on to the next question. Match the following terms in Group A with their description in Group B. So we have certain terms in Group A and their definitions in Group B. So the correct answer is D, that is, monitoring is where you measure and record all the variables or parameters of your concern at certain interval, such as air quality, water quality, noise level, traffic generated, and employment created. So P matches with 2. Then environmental impact auditing or evaluation involves comparing the impacts predicted with what was done in the EIA report with the actual after implementation. So Q matches with 3. Then environmental management auditing reviews the public and private corporate pattern and program for environmental management and the associated risks and liabilities. So R matches with 1. So the correct answer is D, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 3, and R matches with 1. Moving on to the next question, state true or false. Monitoring in India is mandatory as per the EIA notification of 2006. Is the statement A, true, or B, false? So the correct answer is that the statement is true. So as per the EIA notification of 2006 under the section 10 for post-environment clearance monitoring, it is mandatory for the projects, and and the project proponent is required to submit half-yearly compliance reports in respect to the stipulated prior environment clearance. So the statement is true. Moving on to the next question. State true or false? The London Olympic 2012 project provided a framework for the monitoring of the biophysical and socio-economic impacts. Is the statement true or false? So this is based on the case study which was undertaken in lecture 30. So the statement is true. The London Olympic 2012 provided a framework for monitoring of biophysical and socio-economic impacts of the project. Okay, so A, true, is the correct answer. So moving on to the next question, impact identification techniques for scoping purpose involves one, environment that are particularly valued should be identified. Two, impacts considered to be of particular concern to the affected parties. Three, methodology should be used to predict and evaluate the different impacts. And four, scale at which those impacts need to be considered. So the correct answer is D, that is all of the above are the impact identification techniques which are used for scoping purposes. It involves all of the four which are mentioned. So all the four options are correct. So D is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question, match the style of EIA. Match the style of EIA given in group 1 with their description in group 2. So in group 1, we have different EIA styles, and in group 2, we have their description. So the correct answer is C, that is rigorous EIA is systematic and intensive EIA process is desirable where scientific analysis can support decision making. Streamlined or rapid EIA is applied where resources are limited or less data is available. Ethical EIA process is a style which is adopted where issues of fairness, equity, and justice are important. And adaptive EIA process is adopted where turbulent and complex situations persist and there are risks, uncertainty, and health concerns. So the correct answer is C, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 3, R matches with 1, and S matches with 4. Moving on to the next question, match the following types of impact prediction with examples given. So in group 1, we have the different impact prediction models, and in group 2, we have the examples. So the correct answer is C, that is hard model, where the use of mathematical situation model plays a central role, is used for air and noise impact. So P matches with 2. Mixed models, where simulation modeling is complemented and sometimes replaced by technically more lower level approaches, is used for traffic impacts, which make considerable use of modeling, but often with some sample survey input. So Q matches with 3. Then soft model, where use of mathematical simulation modeling is virtually non-existent, matches with 1, that is perception studies. So the correct answer is C, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 3, and R matches with 1. Moving on to the next question. The choice of EIA method is based on following range of considerations. 1, geographical areas. 2, different stages of assessment. 3, resources at hand. And 4, criteria of replicability. So which of the following options are correct? So the correct answer is D, that is all of the four options are considered for making the choice of EIA method, that is the geographical area, the different stages of assessment, resources at hand, and the criteria of replicability. So D, 1, 2, 3, and 4 is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. So state true or false. The following diagram shows the causal network diagram that demonstrate causal relationship between their elements that can be used to identify what kind of project will happen from the proposed project. What kind of impact will happen from the proposed project. So is this statement true or false? On the right, we have the causal network diagram. So the statement is true. So these are diagrams that demonstrate the causal relationship between their elements and can be used to transparently demonstrate the causes and effect. So the given diagram shows the causal network diagram and the statement is true. So A is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question, label the missing elements of decision tree for environmental acceptability. So we have missing terms P, Q, R, and S, which stand for which needs to be arranged based on what is the correct element meaning. So the correct answer is A, that is P is acceptable, Q is manageable, R is unacceptable, and S is abandoned in part or whole. So this is from the impact assessment prediction lecture. Moving on to the next question, match the following. So we have terms relating to cost benefit analysis and their definitions given in group 2. So the correct answer is C, that is shadow pricing is aggregation of a goods comparing the cost in one form and the benefits are in another form. For example, concrete which is used for dams and the electricity which is produced from it. So the cost of concrete is considered, whereas the electricity produces the benefit, but they are measured in two different terms. So P matches with 2. Then discount pricing is the aggregation over time, that is comparing the costs incurred now from the benefits that are expected in the future. So it is over time. Q matches with 3. Then equity weights aggregation over people, that is comparing the cost occurring to different people. So an example in this was the cost of 100 rupee to a wealthy person is not the same as the cost of 100 rupee to a poor person. So R matches with 1. So the correct answer is C, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 3, and R matches with 1. So, moving on to the next question. 4 levels in increasing the public power and public participation methods are 1. Information feedback methods, 2. Consultation, 3. Joint planning, and 4. Delegated authority. So, which of the following are the correct methods based on the options given? So the correct answer is D. That is all of the four are the 4 levels of increasing public power and participation methods. That is information feedback methods, consultation, joint planning, and delegated authority. Okay, moving on to next question. Match the following purpose for public participation in EIA. So we have the broad purpose of doing public participation in and the specific purpose and activity. So the correct answer is C. That is, the purposes for doing public participation include to obtain public input into decision taken elsewhere. So this includes activities like providing the public information, filling in the information gap, and problem solving and social learning. Where so P matches with 2. Q, which is to share decision making with public, includes activities like reflecting the democratic principles of EIA used to obtain consent of those affected, and the democracy and participation as an educative function. So Q matches with 3. Then R is to alter the distribution of power and structures of decision making. Matches with 1, which is the activities like involving the marginalized group and shifting the locus of decision making. So the correct answer is C, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 3, and R matches with 1. Moving on to the next question. The components of monitoring should include 1. Summary of the significant impacts identified in the environmental impact report. 2. Mitigation measures recommended for each significant impact. 3. Monitoring requirements and responsible agencies for each mitigation measure. And 4. Timing and frequency of the monitoring. So, which of the following does monitoring components include? So, the correct answer is D. That is, all of the 4 are the components which are included in monitoring. So, D is the correct answer. Moving on. So, since we did not receive any queries from you in this week, we don't have any queries to answer. Thank you for attending the session. And if you have any feedback, you can put it in the discussion forums. With that, I will close this session.